When your body temperature drops below a critical point, your own brain becomes your worst enemy. It begins to distort reality, forcing you to make decisions that, from the outside, seem like absolute madness. A 19-year-old student, a future doctor, knew this physiological trap inside out. In November 2022, she set off on a day hike in the mountains of New Hampshire to tick off the final peaks on her ambitious list. But by the agreed time at the meeting point where her mother was waiting, she never descended. When the large-scale search parties finally discovered her tracks in the snow, they froze in disbelief. The scene they encountered defied all logic. A trail of chilling discoveries revealed that, despite being just a stone's throw from the safety of the path, instead of heading towards people, she had begun to methodically drive herself into the mountain's most dangerous trap. And the place where those tangled tracks eventually led held a secret so harrowing that the search operation left even the most hardened state rescuers in shock. Her name was Emily Monica Sotelo, and before that November morning, her life was made up of qualities that rarely coexist in one person. She grew up in Westford, a small town in Massachusetts, the daughter of two doctors, a gastroenterologist father and a psychiatrist mother. Her mother had named both daughters after her favorite poets, as if to mark them out early on as people who valued words and meaning. Her younger sister, Michelle, stayed at home. Emily, by 19, was a second-year student at Vanderbilt University studying biochemistry and intending to become a doctor. A public health specialist, the kind who treats not just one patient, but entire communities. How she filled her time between classes explained her better than any character reference. She had trained as an emergency medical technician and knew what those courses teach, how to sustain someone else's life in those first few minutes when every second counts. She volunteered at a school on a Navajo reservation, worked on university programs to combat opioid addiction, led reminiscence therapy sessions for the elderly in care homes, and, according to her loved ones, nursed even a sick pet with the same patience. Caring for others wasn't just an act for her, it was her way of life. Hiking had entered her life only a couple of years prior and quickly became a new form of that same persistence. She set herself the goal of climbing all 48 of New Hampshire's peaks over 1,200 meters, and by the end of autumn she had already ticked off about 40, nearly the entire list, collected patiently, outing by outing during the warmer months when light gear was perfectly adequate for such routes. She chose the 20th of November for the 3 remaining peaks that stretched along the Franconia ridge in a single chain, and the plan seemed logical precisely because it was based on all her previous experience. Just after 4 in the morning, still in total darkness, her mother dropped her off at the trailhead below the western wall of the ridge. It was a through hike. Climb up one side, traverse the ridge, and descend to the southern end, where they had agreed to meet in the afternoon around 3:30. Her previous experience also explained the gear Emily wore as she stepped into the darkness. A thin jacket, leggings over thermal underwear, 3-season trainers, no hat, no goggles, and no spikes on her soles. For 40 summer peaks, that kit had been more than enough, and at the time it seemed just as sensible. She went on alone, as she had for almost her entire list. Solitude in the mountains was not a risk to her, but a familiar freedom. The first few hours of the ascent led through a quiet, windless forest, her body warmed by the exertion, and there was something triumphant in that steady silence. The project she had been patiently working on for 2 years was now just one day's hike from completion. The fact that there was no one nearby to notice a single wrong turn didn't cross her mind that morning. What that kit didn't account for, the weather forecast for the upper summits had warned of that morning. While she was climbing the forest trail in the calm, the instruments up high were describing a completely different mountain. Temperatures around -18 degrees Celsius, wind chill making it feel like -34, and gusts of up to 150 kilometers per hour, conditions in which thin fabric ceases to be clothing. The gap between what she was wearing and what awaited her above meant nothing in the forest and gave no warning. It was destined to reveal itself up there, where the first unnoticed error in her preparations would begin to be compounded by a second. Above the tree line, the mountain changed, not gradually, but abruptly. The trees, which had been blocking the wind, vanished within a few dozen paces, and the open ridge left the hiker at the mercy of the very current the morning forecast had warned about. Only now, that current was no longer a line of text in a forecast, but a physical wall, striking her chest and chilling her body faster than her muscles could generate heat. Emily was climbing towards Mount Lafayette, the highest on her ridge that day, and the first on the long traverse to the south, doing so as she had dozens of times before, stubbornly placing one foot in front of the other up the rocks and packed snow. The trouble with an open ridge in bad weather is that it leaves no landmarks. When she reached the summit dome, the wind was blowing snow almost horizontally, and visibility had shrunk to just a few paces. The distant reference points had vanished, as had the marked trail that led down to shelter by a short but far from obvious turn. In such weather, this place has led even more experienced people astray. It only took missing one turn to start descending down the slope in a straight line towards where a freezing person is most naturally drawn, downwards, where, by any common logic, it should be warmer and closer to the road. But that is exactly what happened. Unable to distinguish the hut below or the next stone cairn, Emily stepped off the marked path and began her descent down the northwest slope, away from all trails, into a closed wooded hollow where this same deception of the terrain had led others before her. This was the point of no return. Every subsequent step down the wrong slope took her further away from the only thread that could lead her back. The slope she was now descending was not a path, but a trap of the terrain. The snow here was loose and deep, waist-high in places, and every step became a struggle. She would fall through, pull herself out, and fight through dense, low scrub, while the ridge with the trail she had left rose higher and higher behind her, becoming increasingly unreachable. Further down the hollow, the slope led her towards water, to the Lafayette Brook, which even in late November did not freeze completely and flowed in open channels beneath the snow. Until this moment, dry feet had been the last thing keeping the cold at bay. Her trainers, unsuitable for winter, had still managed to retain that thin layer of warmth around which her body's fragile balance held. At the water, that balance collapsed. Stumbling on a hidden patch of open water, she soaked her feet in the stream and lost one of her trainers. And in that instant, physics finally turned against her. Water draws heat from the body dozens of times faster than air. Wet fabric in temperatures near -30 stops warming and becomes an evaporator, pulling the last reserves of heat from her feet and shins at a speed the body could no longer replenish. This was the irreversible blow after which the struggle ceased to be an even match, not a broken pace or lost minutes, but the total depletion of the body's heat reserves. And there was almost nothing left to replenish them. The hydration system in her backpack had frozen by this time, depriving Emily of even a sip of water. She had no shelter, no spare clothing, and her phone, the only thread to the outside world, had long since died in the cold. All she had left were wet feet, fading daylight, and a slope that led the wrong way. What happened to her body next was no longer subject to willpower or character, but to the cold sequence of physiology. Hypothermia develops in stages, and the first is shivering. The body burns its remaining energy to generate heat, and at this stage, a person is still capable of acting. But as the core temperature drops, the extremities are the first to fail. Blood retreats from the hands and feet to the heart and brain, and with it goes fine motor control. Fingers stop obeying, and even zipping up a jacket or grabbing a branch becomes a task that consumes all one's attention. Then the cold reaches the part of the brain that distinguishes a correct decision from a fatal one. The freezing brain narrows the field of perception and judgment. The world collapses to a few immediate steps. Complex reasoning gives way to one simple urge, and that is why Emily continued to do the only thing that still seemed meaningful to her. She kept walking down. In the logic that remained accessible to her, down meant the valley, and the valley meant the road, the motorway, whose noise could be heard from the slope in quiet weather. She moved almost in a straight line through the scrub towards this imaginary line of salvation, and that movement was, in its own way, rational. It just didn't lead to people, but deeper into a closed hollow where no one was looking for her yet. This was the bitterest arithmetic of her situation, visible only from the outside. She was just over a kilometer from the nearest trail, a distance she would have covered in 20 minutes in a summer day, without even noticing. By all external measures, salvation was close, but between her and it lay not those minutes, but deep snow, steep terrain, darkening forest, and a body from which the last resource was draining away with every hour. In the late stages of hypothermia, a state occurs that doctors call paradoxical undressing. The blood vessels, having lost control, suddenly dilate, blood rushes to the skin, and the freezing person is overcome by a false, deceptive feeling of heat, under the influence of which they may tear off the very last things keeping them warm. The care that Emily had so generously showered on others throughout her short life was now what she needed herself, but there was no one nearby to provide it. And as the short November day burned out over the ridge, down in the valley below its western wall, a very different countdown had begun. At the southern edge of the ridge, where the route was supposed to end, a typical Sunday was still unfolding. Her mother arrived at the meeting point at 3:30, the time they had agreed upon during the dark morning drop-off, and began to wait. A half-hour delay in the mountains means nothing. The route is long, snow slows you down, and anyone who walks these trails knows that estimated times are merely a guide. But as the short November light began to fade, and her daughter still hadn't emerged from the woods, anticipation turned to anxiety, and anxiety to a call to the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, the agency responsible for search and rescue in the state's wilderness. There was no bureaucratic delay. Her mother had reported it in time, and the first teams went out that same evening. Any delay that occurred here was dictated not by the system, but by nature itself, the darkness and the wind that the rescuers had to head into, without knowing exactly where on the vast ridge to look. The operation was led by Fish and Game, and in the first few hours it was modest in scale. Only a few teams headed out onto the slopes in the dark, because searching blindly at night in hurricane-force winds was both dangerous and almost hopeless. By dawn, the machine began to ramp up to full capacity. By Monday evening, more than 60 ground rescuers were involved, organized into nearly 20 teams. People from the Pemigewasset Valley and Androscoggin County Volunteer Search Squads, K-9 units trained to pick up human scent, ground teams, and a headquarters coordinating their movements from maps. When the weather permitted, a National Guard helicopter would rise above the ridge. The operation was overseen by Colonel Kevin Jordan, the department's law enforcement chief, a man with dozens of such missions under his belt. The search tactics were based on sound logic, combing the trails and the ridge, the lines along which a sensible person would move, and where it would be most natural to look for a trail. But that was exactly where the trap lay, invisible from the inside. Emily had long since been neither on the trails nor the ridge. She had wandered away from all logic of the route. into a closed-off hollow that the search line simply didn't reach. Time and again, rescuers walked the right path past the wrong one, while the work itself was exhausting them. The frost, the wind, and waist-deep snow turned every hour on the slope into an ordeal that took a heavy toll even on well-trained people. For 2 days, the search yielded nothing, and the massive efforts of dozens of people dissolved into the sheer scale of the ridge. The breakthrough came on Tuesday afternoon. In the upper reaches of Lafayette Brook, the very stream to which the northwest slope had led Emily, rescuers stumbled upon tracks and items that could only belong to her: a plastic bottle and a banana, mundane trifles of a day hike, appearing where no route had ever been. The trail led further down the hollow. The searchers followed it for a little over 200 meters, but darkness and the steep, dangerous terrain forced them to retreat before reaching the end. By Tuesday evening, the hope still held at headquarters quietly gave way to a different understanding. Based on where and how these items were found and how much time the person had spent in the freezing cold without shelter by that point, the nature of the operation changed. It was no longer called a rescue. No one said the final words aloud, but the trail by the stream pointed the direction too clearly, and everyone understood that the morning would bring the conclusion. Wednesday morning confirmed what had been left unsaid the previous evening. Following yesterday's tracks down along the bed of Lafayette Brook while simultaneously scanning the slope from the air, rescuers found Emily shortly after 11 o'clock. On the northwest slope of Lafayette, between the stream bed and the summit, about a kilometer or so from the nearest trail. She was lying where a straight line of descent through the brush had led her, still in that same thin jacket and windproof trousers, without a hat, with a small backpack in which the frozen hydration bladder remained. Her 3 seasoned trainers were with her, but she was barefoot. That final stage of hypothermia mentioned earlier had turned here not into a line from a textbook, but into bare feet on the snow. The cause of death was what one might have expected from her very first step onto the wrong slope. The effects of the cold, hypothermia. But this conclusion had a second, far heavier facet that only became clear now. According to Colonel Jordan's assessment, Emily had barely survived the very first night, and that meant that throughout all 70-plus hours of searching, all 60 people on the slopes, all the helicopter sorties and dog teams had from the very beginning been looking not for a person who could still be saved, but for someone who was already gone. The rescue machine had spent almost all that time chasing time that had run out on the very first evening. And the day she was found was the 23rd of November, the very day Emily was meant to turn 20. The date she had been so stubbornly working towards with her list of peaks became the date she was taken off the slope, and a helicopter carried her body across the ravine to the Cannon Mountain ski resort on the opposite side. The story didn't end on the slope of Lafayette. Emily's parents, the very 2 doctors who had raised her with the habit of helping others, turned their grief into action just weeks after her death. They established a charitable foundation in her name, a foundation for safety and perseverance, to give hikers the knowledge about winter mountains that their daughter lacked, and to support the very search teams that had looked for her on the slopes. These searches had their own price. Discoveries like the one that awaited rescuers in the upper reaches of the stream leave an indelible mark on people in such freezing cold, and according to Colonel Jordan, some leave this work entirely after such missions. Later, her parents completed the remaining peaks on her list, finishing the tally she hadn't managed to close herself. There was neither condemnation nor romanticization in their words about it. Her father spoke of how the perseverance Emily had in abundance must always be balanced by caution, and her mother called her daughter a shooting star that burned too bright and too fast. This death left almost no systemic trace of the kind one might expect from a high-profile tragedy, and that is its own particular bitterness. No new law appeared because the old ones were sufficient. The set of rules known in these parts as the Hiker Responsibility Code existed long before Emily and warned exactly of what happened to her. The issue wasn't a lack of rules, but the fact that the slope of Lafayette catches people in the same mistake time and again. Back in 2004, on this same mountain, another woman died of the cold after losing her way in a snowstorm, and just a month after Emily, that same winter, about 800 meters from a nearby trail loop, the body of another hiker was found who didn't even have a head torch with them. The mountain hadn't changed, only the names of those it took had. And yet the main mystery of this story lies neither in laws nor in statistics. The exact path of her ascent, that single moment when a return was still possible, the circumstances under which she parted with her footwear, all this remained beyond what can be reliably reconstructed. But something else is heavier than the factual gaps, and no report can close it. How a person who, by education and calling, understood better than most what the cold does to the body, still stepped off the known trail in the direction from which there is no return. There is no answer to this question. There is only what remains. There remains that same deceptive turn above the tree line that will lead someone else astray in the next blizzard. There remains the list of 48 peaks that her parents had to finish for her. And there remains that bitter symmetry that can neither be fixed nor forgotten. A girl who, throughout her short life, knew how to be there in those first minutes when another's life could still be saved, met those minutes alone, where there was no one nearby who could return the favor. When an unprepared novice dies in the mountains, society easily finds someone to blame: stupidity and inexperience. But how do you judge a person who knew the rules of the game better than most, yet broke them anyway? The story of Emily Sotelo leaves a heavy aftertaste precisely because of this paradox. A future doctor, a paramedic, a person who saved others. What was it really? A tragic accident that could happen to anyone, or the ultimate form of overconfidence? Do our own skills give us a false sense of invulnerability? I'm sure each of you has your own answer to this question. Let me know in the comments. Do you condemn her for going into the mountains in summer trainers, knowing all the risks, or do you feel sympathy for the terrible trap she fell into? Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel and watch our other videos. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. See you next time.